Morning, Jerry. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Mark. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. And we've got an interesting topic this morning, haven't we? We're talking
Yeah.
about risk and the role that risk plays, I guess, in property investment, and I guess we're debunking some myths to a certain extent as well around risk, but also hopefully we will send people away with some practical ideas around mitigating some of the risks in.
Yeah, and I think the danger of risk is that risk is potentially danger, right? Wrong choice of word. I think that a lot of people look at it a little bit too simply. It's pretty complex, and there are lots of areas of risk, aren't there, in the property? And for me, originally, I would have just looked at it and said, well, this is just about the development I'm doing and the risk associated with that, right? Yeah. And maybe not finding a tenant, but there's so many other areas, isn't there?
There is, even to the point of the risk of getting started as a professional property investor, the risk of changing your work situation so that you focus more on property, right down to those sort of lifestyle risks, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of that's opportunity cost, though, isn't it? That thing about, if I don't do this, what's the consequences of not doing it? Which is sometimes is the way of actually getting yourself. Some people find that's the only way to motivate themselves.
Yeah,
fear of missing out.
But it's funny property, isn't it? Because it's we were talking about this before jumping on the call. It's one of those things that we've got age-old phrases associated with property which we're all familiar with, like safe as houses, and a lot of people recognize that actually putting your money into property, into real estate, is in the long term one of the safest investment vehicles. However, we've all probably been at the receiving end of I don't know, loved ones or people around us warning about, oh, do you really want to get into that right now? That sounds like a risky project. Or is this the right time to be investing because of inflation and recession? And it's on the other side of the coin. It's perceived in some ways to have a lot of risk attached to it. So that's why I thought this would be an interesting conversation to sort of try and debunk that a little bit. Do you find the same thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of contrasting views, and what exactly is risk and how much is it influenced by the person rather than the situation? And I would think that the person and their approach is fundamental to it, isn't it? Yeah. So you could actually have the same scenario for two different people. You're talking there about loved ones saying, should you be doing this? Is this risky? Well, it might be. Yeah. But because it depends a little bit on that individual and the strategies, the knowledge they have, all those sorts of things, which I guess we'll come on to. Yeah. But it's quite interesting that for one person, it could be really risky. For somebody else, it could be mundane and just normal. When you first got started then, did you, looking back now, how did you feel about those first steps in terms of risk? Were you even conscious of it?
I was certainly conscious of it. I think the risk, getting into the unknown aspects of working with builders, managing a refurb budget, just the stuff that's, for most people getting started in property, is completely alien territory, and you'll never, unless you're coming from a employment construction background, you're never going to have brought really any transferable skills into that. So I think that's where we were aware of the risk, was actually sort of going headlong into this. We were fairly confident around demand. So we were looking at HMOs initially. This is where we were initially investing. We were fairly confident with the demand that we'd established. We were pretty confident with our numbers. And therefore, the risk really was project management, I guess.
You mentioned about project risk, and I was asking you what about that first one. But as you grow your portfolio, more new risks come in, such as economic risks, insurance risks. In terms of actually, what are you insuring here? Is it just the building, or is there other aspects like you as a person? Is it the subcontractors? Are you ensuring that subcontractors have proper insurance? All those sorts of things start coming. CDM rules. There's a lot of risks there that I guess are just pieces of the jigsaw you need to learn as you go on. And with time and help, you should be able to mitigate them. But it amazes me. I still find that every now and then I'm looking at a project or development or something aspect that we're working on. I think, hold on a minute, I haven't really thought about what happens if that happens.
Yeah.
What happens if that happens, and are we covered for that? And
Yeah.
sometimes it's not paying a physical insurance sum, but it's an activity or something you have to do to try and mitigate that.
Yeah.
It's quite. I think the industry is quite forgiving. You know, you take time to do things, but there are some key risks, I guess, you need to cover in terms of insuring yourself, covering certain things with contractors and projects. What sort of things do you think would fit in with that, Mark?
Well, I'm just thinking actually while you're talking about what risks for me are sort of a constant, if that makes sense. What risks am I aware of still at this stage in our property journey, in the same way that I probably was at the beginning, and I'd imagine I share some common ground with most people investing. The risk of being potentially not over leveraged, because that is actually one of the steps that we can take to mitigate against the risk of things like negative equity. But leverage is the degree of leverage you have in terms of lending is a risk, and the long-term plan and the steps, putting steps in place to deleverage to a certain extent, because that helps reduce perceived risk, I think. And the other one is the risk of having all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
So, like, reflecting on our own situation right now, we're very all in on hospitality and serviced accommodation. And as I've said multiple times on the podcast, I am not in any way fearful of regulation that is likely to come into the industry. In fact, I would welcome it. That's not an issue. Having said that, there's some kind of grounded logic in diversifying your portfolio, potentially having a slight mix of strategies, and just the feeling that mitigates against the risk of, running yourself into a dead end effectively.
And there's another risk here that actually probably has the biggest impact, or at least through people's thinking about it, is the risk of failure.
Yes.
That's maybe not one you can insure against.
Yes.
But it's one that you probably have to do the most work on. Is that feeling of risk of failure, proving the naysayers right, and the challengers that were maybe saying that you don't know what you're doing. The ones that have really gone on and made things happen, what do you see different? Is it their perception of risk? Is it something to do with their perception of risk of failure, or they don't have a risk? What's your thoughts about people that have come through, been very successful? What's their attitude to being risk? Has it been just cavalier, or actually they've just got a different approach to it?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? And I think it comes down to being really clear about defining what we're talking about here when we talk about risk. Because I think some people, when they're talking about risk, are actually talking about being reckless or speculating, which is not what we're in the game of at all. In fact, risk management is the game. It's actually, being very confronting the risks and doing a really in-depth analysis of the risks in a way. So really, tackling them head on, because only by doing that can we then take proactive and practical steps to mitigate those risks. So that's for me is the difference, is the perception of risk and the embracing risk as part of the process, and not be it's like that famous quote around bravery, isn't it? Bravery is not the absence of fear, it's what you do in response to fear.
Feeling the fear and doing it anyway. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that risk management is not about ignoring risks. If anything, it's about really recognizing and analyzing the risks and then taking steps.
So you don't, but it doesn't sound like you consider yourself risky, your attitude.
I wouldn't consider myself to be risky. No, because I don't consider our model and our approach to be risky, if that makes sense.
So million pound developments with no fixed income, right? Trading businesses, not risky at all.
Well, no, I would acknowledge that the risks exist. This is the difference, isn't it? I would acknowledge that the risk exists, but but I don't feel that what we're doing is risky because, and I guess this is where your due diligence comes in. What does the market require? What need is there for particular offerings, and really looking at very early on in the process, so that by the time you bring this product to the market that you've already qualified a demand for it. Because obviously spending time with yourself, and you're talking a lot about speaking to other people that operate in the area and to potential licensees or tenants before the building's even complete. So it's not this is risky. I really hope people are going to like this when I've done it. I think it's great, but you're actually almost like, generating and qualifying that demand at the same time as you go through. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, that would be right. And we don't generally go, at the moment, our network of buildings are pretty close together. So there's always a little bit of overlap, almost a cross-selling between buildings. Some of them the furthest I think they're apart is about an hour from the sort of one extreme to the other. And we do have tenants or clients that use, buildings on both extremes. So if we went somewhere completely new, then I know I am increasing my risk because my understanding of that market is not as strong as currently, in our area that we're in. Should we just talk about maybe some of the risks we think about? You just mentioned one there. A risk is not knowing what market demand is.
Yeah, definitely.
Another one would be, as you said, having plan A, B, C, D, and E. It's if this thing doesn't work, what's my backup here? So that risk of it not working.
Particularly if you're dealing in developments where, because we always talk about having a second exit, right? At least one additional exit. So if you are doing a buy to let, will the property, if for whatever reason the rental market shifts, will the property sell and still make a profit, or still at least cover your costs, and vice versa? If you're looking to flip a property but the market takes a downturn and it's not conducive to flipping, can you rent that property out and it will still wash its face? When I don't know what you find, but we are starting to go towards developments where we're altering the building to such an extent that it would be very difficult to revert that to any other use than its current use. So, I'm thinking about the hotel development that we've recently launched down on the south coast. It would be very difficult without significant additional expenditure to revert that, for example, to resi. Although a lot would have to go wrong, in a sense, to end up in the worst case scenario, but you do end up thinking, well, in this case, we don't have a fallback necessarily of a second exit other than to flip it on.
So this is really interesting. We're both in the space business, right? And we're both in service space. You're the only difference is yours
by the night.
People stay overnight, ours tend to stay during the day, right? But what you're talking about there is when you take a project or an investment and you turn it more into an operating business, or there's an operating element, which by definition means that there should be higher margin. Yes. That's the point of doing it. So now we're starting to talk a little bit about risk and reward.
Yeah.
So you may be investing more or being a bit more niche. So what you've done is you've kind of leveraged the risk a little bit here and just saying, right, I'm gonna knuckle down to a more specific niche because I have understand that can provide me with a higher return.
Yeah.
But there is a risk, slightly higher risk, as you've just pointed out, that I'm a bit more niche here, but there's much higher reward, which does mean that your payback period should be much quicker.
Yes.
So that there's it's having that conversation in your mind all the time about risk reward. And if somebody says, I've got an investment here that's going to give you 25-30% return on total money in, not capital employed, but the total money in, a lot of people would say, well, that's going to be a high risk strategy. And it probably is.
Yeah.
But it's probably quite niche.
Yes.
So you need to know what you're doing, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work.
Yeah. It's like making your peace with the worst case scenario, isn't it?
Yeah.
If this happened, what would we do? We'd do this. And if this happened, it'll be fine because we'll just do this. Your perception of the risk changes depending on where you are in your journey.
It's interesting, isn't it? And you're talking there about confidence, and confidence can lead to higher risk.
Yeah.
There's if you've got overconfidence,
Yeah.
you may start getting to that other risk, which is being blindsided by not being consciously trying to be open to look at other. This is not to be paralyzed by analysis or to just not do anything, but equally just being open to the mind of the fact that what if that happened? What if this happened? And being, I guess, not overconfident in your skill set. And there are a lot of choppy things going on in the market right now, aren't there, that we need to think about in going back to that list. So one being finance, of course, and the risk of interest rates going up. The other one, which is very overt right now, is about energy costs, which you and I both take control of. It's not necessarily our clients that do that. And there's also the risk of things happening, not just economically, but equally internally in the company, whether it's to you, whether it's one of your key employees, whether it's one of your key suppliers, all these different things that you kind of need that extra layer of support should one of those things happen. The challenge, of course, is if you're trying to get started in this, thinking about all that means you never get started.
But at some point, we all have to take a leap. And I know that to some people sounds reckless, or that's and that's not what it is. But you know, you can go round and round in circles. You're never going to remove all of these aspects of elements of risk 100%. You're just going to have to do it. You can do all the due diligence in the world, but until you actually put that product out into the market, you by definition won't truly know if there's a demand for it.
There's that taste of the risk then, right there, because that's the point we actually have to make the decision. But all of that background work is to mitigate risk. And there's that whole juxtaposition where people say, oh, you need to diversify. You need to diversify. And it depends on who you are and what you're doing. Starting out with a diversified portfolio, to me, sounds pretty risky. Because if you're just getting started, how are you going to know with enough detail about all those different markets and those different entry points into property? So actually, that is not going to work in reducing your risk. You actually need to concentrate on one activity, one strategy, and just get to know it really well. There we are saying, if you're getting started, get really focused, get really good knowledge on a specific strategy in a specific area. But then when you start building that portfolio, one of the risks starts appearing is being in one area, one specific strategy, and everything else is actually a risk, right? That's the oddity of it. So it does depend on where you're at in your journey.
I believe that one of the things that differentiates a professional property investor from somebody who, just wants to amateur armchair investment, just wants to park some cash and hopefully realize a yield from it. What defines us as professional property investors is our ability to deploy whatever strategy best fits the current market conditions in the area we're looking at. And so I guess I draw confidence from knowing that actually if there was a shift in whatever that might be, I would have enough knowledge to at least get started, and B, a community of people that I can tap into that have a lot more knowledge than I do, to be able to then roll out a strategy that does work. And actually for a period of time, if the economic climate or market conditions dictate, I might switch to a slightly different strategy, because that is what is optimal for that situation.
Talking about mitigation, I mean, the fundamental thing here is mitigation of risk is through knowledge and experience.
Yes.
And you're either going to have to go out there and learn that yourself, or you try and lean on others that have been there before to try and get those lessons early to mitigate that risk for yourself.
Yeah. Knowledge and experience, not necessarily your own.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think, I feel there's a tendency that some people in their excitement and enthusiasm to make changes to their lives, and they think, they believe, and we've got enough evidence to suggest that they're right to believe that property could be the solution to that, but they leave the day job too early in that process. What would your advice to be to someone who was saying, look, I just want to pack in my job, I want to go full-time as a property investor,
We can't just generalize on that, can we? It's so much down to the individual. Some people work really well with their back up against the wall.
Yeah.
But you need to understand yourself fully before you do that on a whim. Just on a whim is not the right thing. And there are some people that just need to have that security blanket, but I think they probably need a little bit of money behind them.
Yeah.
Or certainly some of that risk reduction, i.e. they've gained a lot of knowledge, they've maybe got some traction going on, there's some projects coming up that they have got in the pipeline that are going to make that difference. It's back to that risk reward thing. Have you got a few plan A, B's and C's? Is there a little bit of backing in the background? Pick a period of time you're going to do this for, but be aware, a bit like an auction, where your ceiling is. I'm going to do this for 6 months. I'm going to do this for 9 months, whatever it is. And if it doesn't quite work to plan, make sure you're not got your head in the sand and you can take some corrective action.
That has been a really interesting conversation. Like I said, I think it's probably the launch pad down various routes we could take it, but hopefully people have found that interesting and useful to listen to. So as always, Jerry, thank you so much for your input this morning. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Mark. It's been great. I love doing these sorts of things because it makes you think about yourself and about how you are doing your day-to-day stuff. So it's part of my learning process too. So thanks for having me on, Mark.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And I will catch up with you soon.
Yeah, will do. Cheers.
Jerry. Take care.